Right. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to this evening's virtual information session for the Pocosin Lakes National Wildlife Refuge Draft Water Management Plan and Environmental Assessment. Thank you for joining us this evening. I am Rebecca Martin. I'm the project leader for the Coastal North Carolina National Wildlife Refuge Complex, which includes 9 national wildlife refuges in eastern North Carolina, including Pocosin Lakes. Before we get started, I'll walk us through briefly how to communicate with us during this webinar. Your cameras and mic controls will be restricted during this meeting. In other words, I can't hear or see you, but you can see the presentation and hear me. Following the presentation, we will hold a question and answer session and give you an opportunity to ask questions through the Zoom platform as well as by phone. We will not be accepting public comments on the content of the draft plan during this information session. We ask that you please submit your comments in writing using the methods that I'll describe at the end of the presentation to ensure that your comments on the plan are captured completely and accurately. During the presentation, towards the end, I'll provide that information on how you can submit public comments on the draft plan. And finally, I just want to make sure everyone's aware that the webinars are being recorded. Tonight's webinar is being recorded so that it can be posted on our website. And we're hopeful that this is going to be helpful for anyone who wants to revisit the presentation or watch later if unable to participate this evening. During this evening's session, we will review our planning process to date, describe the draft water management plan and alternatives in the environmental assessment, explain the methods for you to provide comments on the plan, and answer questions that you may have. I'm joined tonight by 2 other staff members of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Howard Phillips is the refuge manager for Pocosin Lakes National Wildlife Refuge, and Sarah Ward is an ecologist with the Raleigh Ecological Services Office. Howard and Sarah will join me in responding to questions during the question and answer portion of the session. Okay. So to start with a little bit of background on Pocosin Lakes, Pocosin Lakes is located in the Albemarle-Pamlico Peninsula, surrounded by the Albemarle and Pamlico Sounds. The refuge encompasses approximately 110,106 acres in Washington, Hyde, and Terrell counties in North Carolina. The Pungo unit, originally Pungo National Wildlife Refuge, is 12,350 acres and was established in 1963 as a waterfowl and migratory bird sanctuary. In 1990, the Fish and Wildlife Service established Pocosin Lakes National Wildlife Refuge and designated Pungo as a unit of the new refuge. Pocosin Lakes was established primarily to conserve unique Pocosin wetlands. A key component of refuge management is to restore and maintain natural processes and biodiversity of a functional Pocosin wetland, and to provide habitat for threatened, endangered, and other federal trust species, as well as other wildlife that occur in Pocosins all or part of the year. Management activities at Pocosin Lakes are guided by the refuge's Comprehensive Conservation Plan, which is a plan that describes the desired future conditions of a refuge and provides long-range guidance and management direction to achieve the purposes of the refuge. The Comprehensive Conservation Plan for Pocosin Lakes established goals and objectives for wildlife populations, habitat management, and resource protection. This draft water management plan is a step-down management plan that builds upon the information, goals, and objectives presented in the CCP with more specific details on management actions to achieve specific outcomes. The draft water management plan charts the course for refuge management in the coming years, protects service investments in this restoration, and prioritizes adaptive management based on site-specific data collection. The plan describes water management infrastructure on the refuge, system functions and limitations, and management strategies to meet refuge goals and objectives. As we began the process of developing the draft water management plan, in keeping with our values of being good managers of the resource and being good neighbors, we incorporated a draft environmental assessment with the plan to provide a transparent, open, and inclusive process to our stakeholders, neighbors, partners, and other members of the public. We hosted open houses to gather comments and ideas about the development of the plan. We engaged our partners, stakeholders, and other interested parties through a variety of interactions and visits. Input received during these interactions helped us to identify topics that are addressed in the plan. The draft plan is based on the best available science and is informed by a refuge-specific water resources inventory and assessment, research, modeling, and monitoring efforts, and involvement from service colleagues who specialize in peatland restoration and management, including staff from Ecological Services, the Partners for Fish and Wildlife Program, and migratory birds. Through this public review period and comment opportunity, we want to hear from our neighbors, our stakeholders, our partners, and others about their thoughts, concerns, support for efforts, interest in efforts, and other meaningful feedback that will inform the final plan. Overall, habitat management at Pocosin Lakes National Wildlife Refuge is greatly influenced by two things: fire and water. Because the refuge is located within a rainfall-driven system, meaning rainfall is the primary source of water in the system, during extreme weather conditions, the refuge can either experience too much or too little water. Too much rain leads to surface runoff, called sheet flow, and potentially flooding issues. Too little water can lead to drought conditions, making the landscape more susceptible to large, habitat-destroying wildfire. A water supply is critical to containing and controlling fire. Therefore, water management is the most critical management need at the refuge. For the purposes of this plan, the refuge is described in 3 management zones: managed waterfowl habitat, highly altered peatlands, and minimally altered peatlands. Managed waterfowl habitat, shown here in yellow, includes Pungo Lake and part of New Lake, croplands, and moist soil and forested wetland impoundments, which total approximately 8,300 acres of the refuge. All managed waterfowl habitat, except for New Lake, is located on the Pungo unit of the refuge. Highly altered peatlands, shown here in pink, include those wetland areas where the land was heavily ditched and drained prior to the establishment of the refuge. To date, the refuge has restored the hydrology on over 37,000 acres of highly altered peatlands. Minimally altered peatlands, shown here in green, comprise most of the remainder of the refuge. About half of the refuge is minimally altered. Generally, there's limited or no water management capability in the minimally altered peatlands. The services management approach will vary within the 3 distinct zones I just described: managed waterfowl habitat, highly altered peatlands, and minimally altered peatlands. The draft water management plan establishes 4 primary water management goals for the 3 management zones. The 4th goal, related to fire management, cuts across all 3 zones. Goal 1 is to manage water resources to provide optimal wintering waterfowl habitat. Goal 2 is to restore, manage, maintain, and protect hydrologically altered peatlands. Goal 3 is to maintain and protect minimally altered peatlands. And goal 4 is to enhance fire management capabilities. The draft environmental assessment describes and evaluates 2 alternatives to meeting the 4 overarching goals of the plan. Under the no action alternative, alternative A, current management of the refuge would continue. The service would protect, maintain, restore, and enhance all of the acres of refuge lands using water management capability for resident wildlife, waterfowl, migratory non-game birds, and threatened and endangered species. Refuge staff would direct all water management actions toward achieving the refuge's primary purposes. Alternative B is the basis for the draft water management plan and is the service's proposed action. Alternative B shifts to an expanded adaptive management framework to evaluate the efficacy of water management actions relative to reference, that is, unaltered or hydrologically functioning Pocosin wetlands. This alternative also expands water management capability in the Pungo unit habitats, evaluates the potential for additional restoration areas, explores mechanisms to improve drainage conditions in low-lying portions of the refuge, and assesses floodplain connectivity to enhance intact peatlands. A common request of the service is to manage drainage levels actively to retain stormwater in response to changing weather conditions and rainfall events. While some stormwater retention occurs in the restoration and waterfowl management areas from simply installing and using the restoration infrastructure, setting lower drainage levels is generally contrary to refuge purposes and goals, would allow peat soils to artificially dry out, and would increase wildfire risks. Consequently, the service considered an active drainage level management alternative and determined it to be infeasible to carry forward because it is not consistent with satisfying the purpose and need for which the environmental assessment is being prepared. Although the service has determined that active drainage management to increase stormwater retention capacity is infeasible to implement as an alternative in this environmental assessment, we are amenable to utilizing refuge infrastructure to facilitate beneficial off-refuge outcomes while also meeting the refuge purpose and goals. Under each alternative, the strategies for achieving the plan's goals and objectives fall into management, research and monitoring, and stakeholder engagement activities. I'm going to move into now more details about how the objectives and strategies differ between each action alternative for each of the 4 goals that I've previously described. Under Goal 1 in Alternative A, the refuge would continue to manage cropland through cooperative farming agreements with local farmers, to manage water on moist soil impoundments, and to manage water to provide seasonally flooded forested wetland habitat. The refuge would continue to manage drainage to promote crop production in agricultural fields and native plants in moist soil impoundments and impounded forested wetlands during the growing season. Following the growing season, the refuge would also continue to shallowly flood impoundments to make the crops and plants available to wintering waterfowl. The refuge would maintain drainage levels for Pungo Lake and New Lake that attempt to maximize roosting and resting habitat and sanctuary for tundra swans, Canada geese, snow geese, and many species of duck. Under the proposed alternative, the refuge would increase the amount of grain produced, the acreage of moist soil impoundments, and the acreage of forested wetland impoundments available to wintering waterfowl. If feasible, the refuge would install a well and pump system on Pungo Lake that could refill the lake following a partial lake water drawdown during the growing season. Under this alternative, the refuge would work with stakeholders at New Lake to balance multiple interests, including agricultural, hunting, and wildlife management needs. Additionally, the refuge would develop innovative web-based tools for engagement with stakeholders and for education purposes and expand the monitoring network by establishing new water monitoring sites. The goal of water or drainage management in the highly altered peatland areas of the refuge is to reverse, to the extent possible without causing negative impacts to adjacent lands, excessive drying of the peat soil via the ditch system, to prevent catastrophic wildfire, and to reestablish Pocosin wetland hydrologic characteristics and vegetation. Under Alternative A in Goal 2, drainage settings and risers would continue to be set and modified adaptively by refuge staff based on professional observation and judgment, informed by 1, collecting water level data at the riser and evaluating its response to rainfall and other factors, and 2, analysis of other research and monitoring data collected in recent years. The refuge would continue to protect restored peatlands from further ditching or draining. Under the proposed alternative, the refuge would install wells at strategic locations to monitor groundwater levels in reference Pocosins that are areas with naturally functioning Pocosin hydrology. This data would then be used to adjust drainage levels as needed to mimic natural hydrologic conditions in the water management units as closely as possible on as much of the water management unit area as possible. The shift toward comprehensive monitoring data to guide drainage level management. Achieving naturally fluctuating wetland hydrology conditions will foster the growth of native plant species, such as Atlantic white cedar and bald cypress, which in turn will benefit native fauna. The refuge would also evaluate and implement as appropriate projects that restore all or part of altered Pocosins without negatively impacting adjacent drained private lands. Higher average river levels controlling conditions at specific locations on the refuge necessitate a change in water management approach from one of re-wetting previously drained soils to one of facilitating water drainage off the land to area rivers. The refuge would develop and implement plans for encouraging the drainage of water and removing impediments to flow in these locations. Under this alternative, the refuge would evaluate opportunities to establish new plantings of Atlantic white cedar and bald cypress in appropriate locations and expand the monitoring network by establishing new ground and surface water monitoring sites. Management in minimally altered peatland habitat focuses on preventing further alterations, detecting and responding to invasive species presence early, and researching various aspects of this habitat type. Under Alternative A, the refuge would continue to protect these areas from any further ditching or draining while, to the extent practicable, maintaining most of the current roads for access. The refuge would also treat invasive species in natural waterways to protect minimally altered peatlands from infestation. In addition to the management strategies under Alternative A, under the proposed alternative, the refuge would expand water level monitoring in intact and minimally altered Pocosins and assess the potential to apply these data to inform management of restored Pocosin areas. The refuge would evaluate and implement as feasible resiliency measures and infrastructure to prevent the loss of intact Pocosins. Under this alternative, the refuge would expand the monitoring network by establishing new ground and surface water monitoring and assess floodplain connectivity to enhance intact peatlands. Under Alternative A in Goal 4, the refuge would continue to use any available water to contain or extinguish a wildfire at the smallest acreage possible and to adapt water management strategies to prevent all or most ground fire during burning operations. In addition to the management activities described under Alternative A, under the proposed alternative, the refuge would expand soil moisture, estimated smoldering potential, and water level monitoring, and expand research on habitat response to wildfire. The refuge would also explore and assess opportunities to increase drainage settings in order to temporarily retain extra moisture from passing storms to facilitate appropriate conditions for resuming prescribed burning operations. We recognize, along with many others, that things are changing in the Albemarle-Pamlico landscape. It is one of the most vulnerable areas to impacts from sea level rise in the country. In the draft plan, we've included a description of how extreme weather events can have significant impacts on refuge and adjacent lands, infrastructure, and water. Hurricanes and other coastal storms can bring large amounts of rainfall in a short period of time, while wind tides or storm surge can push waters even higher in the rivers. The combination of high rainfall and hindered drainage into the rivers can result in extensive flooding on the landscape. Alternatively, during droughts, when there's a lack of water supply, evapotranspiration can dry out the peat soils, and the region can become more susceptible to large, catastrophic wildfires. Consistent with the refuge mission and purpose, the focus of management is on restoring hydrology and reducing the risk of catastrophic wildfire. However, there are circumstances where refuge infrastructure may provide some potential to reduce extreme weather impacts. Decisions regarding adjustments to drainage levels prior to forecasted storms will be considered on a case-by-case basis and at a limited geographic scope, considering the best available information about each storm, including water levels prior to possible drawdown, the storm's projected path and intensity, projected timing and intensity of storm surge, confidence in projections, and other factors. Given the associated risks, decisions regarding if and when to modify drainage settings during a pre-storm window will be weighed carefully. Additionally, we have included a section in the plan that describes supportive and complementary strategies and partnership with others. Given the interconnectedness of the drainage network, these supportive and complementary strategies aim to broaden the understanding of water movement on the landscape, identify barriers to water movement or other issues across the landscape, and identify opportunities for incentive programs and other possible solutions for addressing barriers and issues identified. While the refuge will not lead many of these strategies, there is an opportunity to contribute significantly to accomplishing them through partnerships. These strategies generally fall into two categories: regional water management studies and cooperation with land managers on mutually beneficial efforts. Land managers have identified the need for regional water management studies to guide potential implementation actions. The service can help establish partnerships or otherwise contribute to the development of regional studies across the Albemarle-Pamlico Peninsula. Specific issues that could be addressed by regional studies include expanded water level monitoring at major drainage outlets to area rivers and the Sound to evaluate the potential effect of rising river levels on water management, developing a water budget for the refuge and surrounding areas connected by the ditch system, identifying and prioritizing areas for intervention to prevent saltwater impacts on low elevation peatlands, and identifying potential flow restrictions or undercapacity drainage networks and associated remedies where needed. Likewise, the service can contribute to efforts to identify and evaluate these barriers to drainage. In some cases, the service can also aid in the resolution of identified issues. If adjacent landowners express interest in restoring Pocosins, the service can support off-refuge Pocosin restoration through sharing data and providing technical expertise to those restoration efforts. Additionally, the service can facilitate partnerships and share technical expertise in several areas that may allow for improved resiliency of lands adjacent to the man-made ditch network. The service can support additional monitoring information, including off-refuge data collection sites, such as tide gauges, to inform management decisions by local land managers and property owners. That concludes the description of the draft water management plan and environmental assessment. Following the conclusion of the public comment period, which closes on July 31st, we will review comments and feedback received and use it to develop a final water management plan. We will announce the completion of the plan and make it available to the public at that time once it's finalized. In the meantime, we will continue to evaluate complementary and supportive strategies to address water concerns beyond the refuge. We will also continue communicating and engaging with our neighbors, partners, stakeholders, and other interested parties. You may submit comments in writing in one of two ways. You can email comments to pocosinlakes@fws.gov, or you can mail comments to Pocosin Lakes National Wildlife Refuge at Post Office Box 329, Columbia, North Carolina, 27925. Comments must be submitted by email by July 31st, 2020, or postmarked if submitting by mail by July 31st, 2020. Before including information such as your address, telephone number, email address, or other personally identifying information in your comments, you should be aware that your entire comment, including your personally identifying information, may be made publicly available. While you can request in your comments to withhold your personal information from public review, we cannot guarantee that we will be able to do so. We're now going to move into the question and answer portion of the session. Please focus your questions as much as possible to the content of the draft plan and environmental assessment. And remember that we are not accepting comments during this webinar to ensure that your thoughts and comments are completely and accurately captured in your words. Comments that you have related to the substance of the analysis and the alternatives should be submitted as written comments so that we can fully consider and respond to them in the final decision document. Thank you so much for your time and attention to the presentation portion of the session. I'm now going to turn it over to Amanda to begin the question and answer session.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda Biederman, and I will be your moderator for the Q&A session. Thank you again for participating in the webinar this evening. So just a reminder, as Rebecca just mentioned, the service will not be accepting public comments on the content of the draft plan during this Q&A session. But if we do not get to the opportunity to respond to your question during this session, you can email your question to the email listed on the previous slide. So we're now going to begin our question and answer session. I will first go over instructions for how to submit a question using the chat function if you are using the Zoom web platform or Zoom app. After we have gone through questions submitted via the Zoom web platform or Zoom app chat feature, we will move on to participants calling in over the phone. So please stay tuned for those instructions if you called in over the phone this evening. So at this time, if you have a question and you are using the Zoom web platform or Zoom app, please go ahead and click on the chat icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you hover your mouse over the bottom of your Zoom screen, the chat icon should appear. So you can type your question into that chat box and please send it to the host of today's meeting, Teresa Ansell. I will then read your question aloud for all participants to hear, and a Fish and Wildlife Service staff member will respond to your question aloud. And we'll try to answer your questions in the order that they are received. And please also note that there may be a bit of a lag between asking your question and a Fish and Wildlife Service staff member answering your question. So we'll give everyone a couple minutes to chat their questions over to Teresa if they do have a question using the Zoom web platform or Zoom app. Again, if you have a question, use that chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or the chat feature also appears on the Zoom app. And you can just chat your question over to Teresa, and then I will read your question aloud. And again, I see that we have a couple phone callers, so please stay tuned. If you do have a question, I'll get to those instructions on the next slide. All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions coming in from people using the Zoom web platform or Zoom app. But if you do have a question as I go over the phone calling in instructions, feel free to send that question over, but we're just going to go ahead and move on to phone callers now. Okay, so if you're calling in through your phone and you have a question, please use or press the digits *9 on your phone to access the raised hand feature to let staff know that you have a question. I will then unmute you so that you can ask your question, and I'll identify you by the last 4 digits of your phone number, and you will remain muted until you raise your hand and I unmute you, so please remember to speak once prompted. So we'll give phone callers a couple minutes. If they have a question that they would like to ask, again, please press *9 to use the raise hand feature, and we'll be able to see that you've raised your hand, and I'll then be able to unmute you and you can ask your question. Again, just to reiterate, if you have a question and you're calling in over the phone, please press *9 on your keypad to let staff know that you have a question, and I will unmute you from my end and you are free to ask your question. All right, looks like we don't have any raised hands from our participants. And I don't see any questions coming in either through the chat feature. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Rebecca, and she's going to lead us through our closing remarks slide and talk to you more about next steps and how to comment. So back over to you, Rebecca.
Absolutely. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, everyone, for joining and for your time and attention today. We will post the questions and answers from our first session on our website, as well as the recording from the session we'll also post on our website. You can find updates on the project, the Draft Water Management Plan, on the website moving forward, and you can find that at www.fws.gov/refuge/ let's see. Our homepage is the easiest way to find it. I was going to share, but for folks on the phone, I'm going to give you our homepage and you can access it from the alerts from there. So that is fws.gov/refuge/Pocosin_lakes. And from there, you can follow the alerts to the draft water management plan page and find all of the details about how to comment through July 31st, as well as the questions and answers from the first session and the recording of this presentation. In closing, I again thank you for your time today and hope you have a great rest of your evening.